With the teacher in the book of Ecclesiastes, we've explored our relationship with joy amid absurdity, our relationship with time, our relationship to the earth and the more than human inhabitants of it. Today we come to All Saints Sunday and the final in our series of sermonic explorations in search of wisdom with the renegade sage Kohelet, the teacher. And today we're invited into a consideration of our relationship with death and with the dead. Whatever your orientation toward death currently, whether fear or avoidance or resigned acceptance, or even a sense of joy at the prospect of life's completion, there are always new ways of entering into relationship with death and with the dead. Generations before us have engaged in a relationship with death in ways that are distinctly different from our own. We can see this in the development of burial practices over the ages right here in our own backyards. For example, the next time you walk by one of the great historic Puritan burial grounds like King's Chapel or the Granary downtown Boston, look closely at the iconography, the winged death heads, the skulls, the hourglasses running out of sand. Look at the messages engraved into the gray slate stones. Memento mori, remember you will die. Tempus fugit, time flies. All of this intended to remind passers-by of the inevitability of death and the fleeting nature of life. Everyone is headed for the grave. These messages resonate quite well with what Kohelet's own message around death has been throughout the book of Ecclesiastes, impending inevitability. Some suggest that an apt summary of the entire book of Ecclesiastes is found in chapter 9, verse 10. Whatever your hand finds to do, do it with your might, for there is no work or thought or knowledge or wisdom in Sheol, the place of the dead, to which you are going. You can't understand Kohelet's quest for wisdom, her search for meaning, her reveling in all of the small joys of life, her relationship with time and with the earth, unless you can come to terms with the teacher's emerging relationship with death. Now, burying grounds like King's Chapel and the Granary aren't cemeteries as we know them today, resting places for the dead where loved ones could visit and remember the lives of their loved ones. They are burying grounds, repositories for the dead, and stark reminders of death. The notion of graves as sites of memory or beautiful memorials to the lives of loved ones was still some centuries away. Our Puritan ancestors' relationship with death and with their own dead changed over time into something slightly more familiar to us. It was Mount Auburn Cemetery in Cambridge, and several years later, Forest Hills Cemetery here in Jamaica Plain and Roxbury, that our burying of the dead emerged into the notion of a cemetery, where the purpose was no longer to remind passers-by of their own death. Instead, the new ideal of the rural or garden cemetery movement was to become a site of memory, marking the lives of those among us who have died, marking graves with symbols of urns and obelisks and willow trees rather than skulls and skeletons and hourglasses, allowing the beauty of nature to inspire visitors into transcendent reflection in a non-sectarian city of the dead. The relationship to death and the dead at Mount Auburn that they cultivated very early in the early to mid 19th century would have seemed absolutely absurd and illegible to 17th century Puritan forebearers of Boston and Cambridge. And even in the early decades of the 1800s when Mount Auburn was founded, it was a controversial idea. Relationships to death and to the dead have changed, and sometimes they change in ways that look unrecognizable to those who have gone before. At a time in our lives when 225,000 people have died of COVID-19 since March, and many of us have lost loved ones under circumstances that didn't allow us to be present with the dying or to join with family to enact our traditional funerary rituals, our own relationship to death and to the dead is changing in this historic moment. And importantly, we have choices to make about how we relate to death and to the dead. No specific type of relationship is inevitable. And on a day like All Saints Sunday, when we summon the memory and even the palpable presence of the dead, those many saints in our own lives and in the wider world, we can take this day and this historic moment as an invitation to renewed relationship with death and with the dead. We can even engage it with a sense of curiosity over how we might live the troublesome days ahead in relationship with death and the dead as allies on the journey. There are two thematic elements in Ecclesiastes related to death that hold significance to us in this moment. The first one is one that, again, for another week, I'm asking you to truly make an imaginative leap to explore the relationality with the dead and with death differently than you may have in the past. So let's start with that one. It starts with this passage from the beginning of the book. Chapter 1, verse 11. The people of long ago are not remembered, nor will there be any remembrance of people yet to come by those who come after them. Kohelet is clearly disturbed by this fact. This is one of the many things in the book that the teacher labels vanity or absurdity. The memory of every person living and yet to live will be forgotten. It's surely not hard to imagine how that can be true. Some are quickly forgotten because they die in the shadows of global systems of violence with no one to witness and no one to remember. Others live in the memories of loved ones for a few generations, still others for many generations in deeds of accomplishment or infamy. But even these will be forgotten on the cosmic scale that Kohelet is facing in Ecclesiastes, in which humanity itself is ephemeral. I wonder if there's a question bound up in this for us to play with. Knowing full well that our own relationship with death and the dead changes over time, at certain periods becoming unrecognizable to those who have gone before, knowing that we have choices to make in relation to the matter of how we will relate to death and to the dead, perhaps we could ask a question like this one. How do we move from remembering our dead and our ancestors who have come before us into a sense of living well with our dead? Or how is their present absence with us helping us to live into the days ahead? There are, of course, cultures around the world that live with the physical materiality of their dead for quite some time, keeping dead bodies of loved ones in the house for months and treating that person like one would treat a living member of the family. Or returning to the place of entombment every year to retrieve loved ones' remains, dress them up, take photographs with them, celebrate their lives and their continued relationship. To us, that relationship with death and the dead seems about as unusual and illegible as the Puritans would find our practices today. But it raises a good question. How do we understand the presence and or absence of dead loved ones? The question of presence and absence is usually one we ask in terms of spatiality and materiality. When the dead are no longer present with us in the space we inhabit through the materiality of their bodies, we experience them as absent. But what if we add the dimension of time to this question? to the experience of presence and absence. If past and future were not entirely separate from the present moment, but enfolded into the present, in layers of temporality, how would that change our relationship to our ancestors? And if we added the dimension of time to considerations of who is present or absent to us at any given point, then beyond living well with our dead, how might we live well with the absent presence of those who are yet to come? Generations, human and more than human, who will call us ancestors, but whose presence, while felt as absent in the present, can be felt as presence in every act and decision and word and intention that creates and shapes and brings into being a realm that we call the future. A future that is to them present. Much of this very imaginative musing has something to do with memory. In the Victorian era, loved ones made jewelry out of their hair of dead loved ones and wore them as necklaces and such. Memory was attached to some physical material of the loved one's body. They might also hire a photographer to take pictures of dead family members, not necessarily just lying on their bed or in a coffin, but sometimes posed with living members of the family. For example, 4 children standing in a row, only one of them is a recently deceased sibling. And photography was so expensive at the time and so inaccessible to most people that the photo of a dead family member might be the only photo they have of that person. How we hold loved ones in memory is a question that people address in nearly every culture and every era of history. We have to grapple with that question in our own lives right now, when the typical rituals and sources of memory and meaning and comfort are not available to us, or at least not to all of us. And the number of those dying in this pandemic are ever increasing. And there is outright denial, erasure of memory in the government about the significance of these deaths. How will we remember? But more than that, I wonder if we could also ask how the dead can be remembered, reassembled, reconstructed, reconstituted, put back together into relationship with the living. What sources of relationality, not just reflective memory, can span not only spatiality and materiality, but temporality? And perhaps beyond our own loved ones, how can we imagine forming relationships across space and time with those who are the forgotten of history that Kohelet laments? People who died in the shadows of global systems of violence, but who need to be summoned into the present as witnesses, even allies, in the days ahead. I imagine this is a question that will summon imagination in the realm of ritual and engagement with embodied senses, relationship with the more than human who have also been in relationship with those from ages past and will be in relationship with those who are to come. But if all of that is a little too speculative and weird for you, that's okay, because the teacher has something more concrete for us to hold on to in relationship to death as well. When Kohelet gets to the end of the book of Ecclesiastes, the teacher engages in a lengthy poetic reflection on death, and there is nothing too ambiguous about what he says here. The message can be summed up in the phrase, rejoice and remember. Hear the two themes in this passage. Even those who live many years should rejoice in them all. Yet let them remember that the days of darkness will be many. He begins the ending of his exploration of all that happens under the sun with a poignant reminder of death. And his message is one that keeps coming up again and again throughout the book. Enjoy life. Rejoice in each day. And for the young, for the youthful, the teacher's message is even more pointed. Remember your Creator in the days of your youth, before the days of trouble come, before the dust returns to the earth as it was, and the breath returns to God who gave it. Do not squander the opportunity to enjoy life and all of its goodness while you are young, despite the futility and absurdity and injustice that you observe around you. This is an unambiguous imperative for Kohelet. Elza Tamez, who's been a companion with us on this journey, says that Kohelet's proposal is to live life as it is, straightforwardly, as a way of resisting the globalizing frustration produced by his soulless society. Light, joy, pleasure, enjoyment, and good humor are the indispensable ingredients we need to savor life with intensity, here and now. Tamez goes on, for Kohelet, the future lies in taking on the present in a different way. He thinks we should not hope to celebrate life in the future. It must be done now, in the midst of the frustration of the present. And with the energy of a youthful body and heart, the future must be lived now. And as we move into the days ahead that are sure to be full of uncertainty and ambiguity and fragility, full of even more death from a global pandemic, these are the admonishments left to us by our teacher on this journey through Ecclesiastes. Remember your relationship to death. Remember your relationship to the dead. And rejoice in the goodness of life while you have it. Because at the end of a courageous search for wisdom, it is as clear to the teacher as it should be to us right now. We are ensconced in vanity, absurdity, ephemerality, futility, breath. So, says Kohelet, the teacher, this is what I have seen to be good. It is fitting to eat and drink and find enjoyment in all the toil with which one toils under the sun for the few days that God gives us life. For this is our lot.